When my parents moved into my new apartment and slowly took over, I realized they never planned to leave, and they had their own rules for my life, but I'm Evan, 28, and until recently, I was living my version of a dream life. After years of scrimping, saving, and some fortunate career breaks, I'd finally managed to get my own apartment. Nothing too flashy, but it was mine. A small, one-bedroom place in the city with a decent view, a kitchen I could barely move in, and neighbors who kept to themselves. After a decade of living with roommates, I was beyond ready for my own space. That sense of freedom was something I'd craved for years, and I finally had it. But that changed the day my parents, Lori, 54, and Ron, 56, showed up at my door with a pair of suitcases, saying they needed a place to crash for a little while. They'd hit a rough patch, they said, financial issues that had unexpectedly left them without a place to stay. They were adamant it would only be for a month, maybe two, just until they got back on their feet. Now, I'd always known they weren't the best with money. They were big spenders without much thought to saving, always assuming things would somehow work themselves out. So it didn't surprise me that they'd run into trouble. I felt conflicted, but saying no wasn't really an option. They were my parents, after all. I figured it was just a matter of putting up with them for a few weeks, and then I'd have my place to myself again. Besides, my mom had promised they'd stay out of the way and not change a thing. That should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off, trying to be optimistic. After all, how much could they really change in such a short amount of time? They moved in the next day, each of them taking over the tiny living room with their bags, some storage bins, and more necessities than I'd expected. Within hours, I could already see things shifting. Lori started rearranging the kitchen cabinets, saying that a few tweaks would make it more functional. I didn't love it, but I let it slide. It was just the kitchen, and she was probably just trying to feel at home. But it didn't stop there. The next day, she tackled the bathroom, moving my toiletries to maximize space and making a little area for herself and my dad, complete with shelves and organizers. My dad, meanwhile, had taken over the couch entirely, setting up his laptop and an old armchair he'd somehow wedged in without asking. He said it was just temporary, but he started lounging there all day, as if he'd always been there. Then came the unsolicited advice. I wasn't a stranger to their opinions, but the way they started to comment on my life now felt different. They'd hint at things I should be doing differently, like how my fridge was full of junk and how I wasted too much electricity. My mom said my diet was appalling and began cooking these big, family-style meals that filled the apartment with the smell of casseroles and stews. I didn't mind the cooking, but it was like my space was slowly turning into an extension of their old house, not my new apartment. As the days passed, my frustration started to bubble up, though I kept it to myself. After all, I reminded myself it was just temporary. But the cracks were starting to show. My friends had noticed too. When they'd come by, they'd hesitate, not wanting to impose on what now felt like my parents' domain. It was like being a guest in my own home, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. The worst part was that their stuff just kept accumulating. My dad asked if he could bring over some important items from their old place, and before I could fully understand what he meant, there were boxes piled in the corner of the living room. Tools, photo albums, trinkets from their previous house. It was like they were setting up for a permanent stay. One evening, after work, I came home to find my mom had rearranged my bedroom, explaining that she'd taken the liberty of reorganizing my clothes and even added a few of her own things in the closet for storage. My dad had also decided to mount a few shelves he'd brought from their old house, saying it would add more space to the apartment. Each little change felt like an invasion, but I kept telling myself to be patient. It was just for a little while, and they were family. Surely, they didn't mean to be overbearing. Or did they? Then, 2 weeks in, my mom sat me down with a notebook in hand. "Evan, I think we need to set some ground rules for the apartment," she said, her voice carrying a tone that brooked no argument. "Rules?" I repeated, genuinely taken aback. "What kind of rules?" She cleared her throat, flipping through the pages. "Well, for one, I think it would be good if we all worked on keeping the space clean and organized. You know, a little structure could really help keep things running smoothly. And Ron and I think it's important that everyone stick to reasonable hours. Coming in late at night isn't good for anyone's health." I stared at her, stunned. Mom, this is my apartment. I've always kept it clean, and I don't really think I need rules for when I come home. She gave a tight smile. I understand, Evan, but having a set schedule will make things easier for all of us. It's about creating a balanced environment. My dad chimed in, not even looking up from his laptop. She's right, Evan. We're all adults here, and structure helps keep things smooth. I wanted to say something, to push back, but the words got stuck in my throat. I felt like a teenager being lectured, and I hated it. But worse than that, I felt trapped. No matter how much I told myself it was temporary, their presence was so intrusive that I couldn't imagine how I'd ever get my apartment back. The rules kept piling up. They wanted me to avoid using my TV late at night, limit my screen time after work, and stop ordering takeout because it was unhealthy and a waste of money. The final straw came when they started asking me to cancel plans so we could have family dinners. My mom even insisted I let her review my finances, saying she could help me cut down on unnecessary expenses. One evening, after another tense day of stepping around each other in the apartment, I decided to confront them. I pulled my mom aside, determined to set some boundaries. Mom, I don't mind helping you guys out, but this is my place. I need my own space back. When are you planning to, find somewhere else? She looked at me, the surprise in her eyes quickly replaced by something sharper. Evan, we're only trying to help you. It's clear you could use a bit of guidance in managing things. And we've got nowhere to go right now. Isn't family supposed to support each other? I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. But that wasn't support. That was control, and it was becoming clear that, whatever their original plan had been, they had no intention of moving out anytime soon. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary arrangement was anything but. Each day, my apartment felt less like a home and more like a place I was visiting, my independence eroding under their steady influence. I felt trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to escape from, and for the first time since they'd moved in, I started to realize that their stay might be permanent. The temporary arrangement with my parents had officially crossed the line into something oppressive. Each day felt like a new layer of control was added to the pile of household rules they seemed to pull out of thin air. What started as little suggestions had snowballed into a list of mandates they insisted were for everyone's benefit. My mom, Lori, was the ringleader of these improvements. She implemented a strict cleaning schedule that even I, a fairly tidy person, found excessive. On Mondays, we were required to deep clean the kitchen, on Wednesdays, the living room, and on Fridays, we did the bathroom. Weekends were for general upkeep. I worked full-time and had no interest in spending my few precious free hours scrubbing grout, but she insisted it was the only way to live properly. She'd sigh, saying, Evan, you have to understand. A clean home reflects a clean mind. It wasn't just cleaning. She took it upon herself to inspect my groceries and put her stamp of approval, or disapproval, on every item I bought. Chips? Gone. Soda? Out. She started filling the fridge with organic foods and would frown at me if I even considered ordering takeout. You're eating too much junk, Evan, she'd say, shaking her head as she handed me a list of approved items. This isn't just about taste. It's about your health. You'll thank me one day. My dad, Ron, wasn't any better. He introduced quiet hours in the apartment from 8 p.m. onward. According to him, winding down early was crucial for maintaining energy levels. For weeks, I felt like a teenager sneaking around in my own place, tiptoeing to avoid disturbing their calm evening routine. I couldn't even watch TV without them glancing over, sighing as though the noise were unbearable. Eventually, I resorted to headphones, but even that drew disapproving looks from my dad. Too much screen time isn't good for you, he said one night as I settled in to watch a late-night show after work. You'd feel better if you just get a good night's sleep instead. Their rules also started bleeding into my social life. They scrutinized every visitor, and after one of my friends came over, they pulled me aside. Evan, we're not sure that friend of yours is the best influence, my mom said, her voice low, as if confiding a great secret. He seemed a bit loud. Don't you think? He's just my friend, Mom. We've known each other since college, I replied, irritated. But she'd just smile in that way she had, like she knew best, and say, well, maybe you should reconsider the people you let into your life. You're trying to build something solid here, aren't you? Their attitude made it nearly impossible to relax with friends. I tried to avoid having anyone over, knowing that my parents would find some reason to disapprove or critique. My social life took a nosedive, and I could feel myself getting more and more isolated. The worst of it all was their insistence on curfews and routines. They constantly reminded me to keep a reasonable bedtime, which was nothing short of absurd. I was 28, yet they acted as though I was still a teenager with a history of poor choices. If I stayed out too late or came home after 10, I'd walk into the apartment and be met with the looks. My mom would greet me with a sigh, a thin smile, and a little comment about taking responsibility for my health. My dad would just shake his head slightly, muttering something about how we don't need late nights to live well. One Friday, after a particularly rough week at work, I had plans to grab drinks with a couple of friends. I felt like I needed it more than ever, an escape from the suffocating hold my parents seemed to have on me lately. But just as I was getting ready, my mom approached me with her usual air of authority. "Evan," she said, looking me up and down, "you know, going out on a Friday night isn't the best way to unwind. Why don't you stay in and have dinner with us instead? I'm making a casserole." It took all my restraint not to snap. "Mom, I've had this planned for weeks. I'm just going to grab a couple of drinks." She gave me that pitying look. "Evan, drinking isn't the answer. You're going to wake up feeling worse. Wouldn't it be better to just spend time with family?" It took everything in me to say no, but I did. I left, but as I sat with my friends later, I felt a strange guilt gnawing at me. My friends were laughing, catching up on each other's lives, and all I could think about was how my parents would react when I got home. Would they still be awake? Would I have to endure another lecture on prioritizing family over empty socializing? Their influence followed me everywhere, like an unwanted shadow I couldn't shake. By the time I got back, they were both awake. My mom was seated on the couch, arms crossed, while my dad sat silently with that disapproving frown. "Evan, do you realize what time it is?" she asked, as though I'd snuck in past curfew. "It's not even midnight," I replied, trying to sound calm, but my frustration seeped through. She sighed, patting the spot next to her. "Sit down, Evan. We need to talk about some things. Your lifestyle choices are starting to worry us. We only want what's best for you." It was the final straw. "This is my apartment," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "I'm an adult. I don't need a bedtime or rules about my friends or anything else." But my protest barely fazed them. They exchanged a glance, the same silent communication they'd used my entire life to make me feel as though I were outnumbered. "Evan," my dad said, his voice infuriatingly calm, "we're here to help. You clearly aren't living in a way that's good for you, and we just want you to be happy and healthy. Can't you see that?" It was a conversation I couldn't win. Anytime I tried to assert my boundaries, they'd turn it around, suggesting that I was immature, unreasonable, or ungrateful. I felt trapped by a combination of their influence and my own guilt, torn between wanting to fight for my independence and fearing the fallout. Each day, the rules grew stricter, the boundaries tighter. They started limiting the time I could spend on my hobbies, hinting that I'd be better off using that time for more productive pursuits. Even when I stayed silent, their rules and criticisms seeped into every part of my life, sapping any sense of freedom or joy I'd once felt about having my own place. With each passing week, I could feel my independence slipping further and further away, like sand through my fingers. This was my apartment, but it felt more like their home with each new rule they imposed. And the worst part? They acted as if they were doing it all out of love, with a gentle reminder each time. "Evan, we're only here to help you live better." But I was starting to wonder if they'd ever intended to leave at all. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the little changes. They'd been temporarily staying with me for almost 2 months now, so some personal adjustments were bound to happen. But small details started to pile up, each one sticking out more obviously as time passed, suggesting something far less temporary than what they'd originally claimed. The first sign was the gradual increase in their belongings. I'd come home from work one day to find stacks of boxes along the hallway, more bins crammed into the living room, and random personal items all over the place. Things I was certain hadn't been there a day before. When I asked my mom about it, she just shrugged. "Oh, it's just a few things we thought we might need while we're here," she said breezily, waving a hand as if it were no big deal. "Just until we get settled again." "Settled where, exactly?" I asked, but she ignored the question, quickly changing the topic to her latest dietary restrictions. Then I noticed something more concerning. I was sorting through the mail one evening and found an envelope addressed to my mom. Not a forward from their old place, but mail with my address listed as hers. When I asked her about it, she was nonchalant. "Oh, yes," she said. "I had a few things redirected here. It's just easier this way since we're here for now." That phrase, asterisk for now asterisk, was starting to sound more like forever. I pressed her about it, and she finally admitted they'd canceled the lease on their old apartment. "You canceled your lease? I thought you were planning to go back when things improved," I exclaimed. "Oh, Evan, it wasn't working out there," she replied, brushing me off as though I were being overly dramatic. "It was a waste of money, and we don't need it. We're better off here." The casual way she said it floored me. They hadn't mentioned a word of this to me, yet here they were, making life-altering decisions as if I had no say. Panic started to settle in. This wasn't just an extended stay. They were planting roots. I knew I needed to address it, but every time I tried, the conversation turned into a lecture about how I was overthinking things. Any mention of an end date to their stay was met with that same vague deflection, as if the thought hadn't even crossed their minds. When I finally sat them down, determined to get a straight answer, they both looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Why are you so stressed about this, Evan?" my dad asked, his tone casual, as though they hadn't just hijacked my entire life. "We're here to help you. Don't you appreciate having family around?" Appreciate. I nearly choked on the word. This was supposed to be temporary. You said it would be a month or two, tops. You didn't say anything about changing your mailing address or canceling your lease. My mom looked at me with that infuriatingly calm smile. "We're here because you need us, Evan. We've seen how you've been living, overworking yourself, eating junk food, staying up late. We're here to help you live a better life, to support you." "But I'm 28. I protested, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't need this kind of help. I was doing fine before you got here." They exchanged a look, as if I'd just confirmed their worst fears. My mom put a hand on my arm, her eyes filled with pity. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that shows you aren't ready to be on your own." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. In their eyes, my protests were just evidence of my need for them. They were convinced that I was too immature, too incapable, too irresponsible to manage my own life. And they were using that as a reason to dig themselves deeper into my space, my finances, and my time. Then, I started noticing something even stranger. On multiple occasions, I tried to confront them directly, only to find that they'd planned their day around my work schedule, conveniently making themselves scarce whenever I was home early. I'd try to talk, and they'd suddenly have appointments or errands that took them out of the apartment. I started to feel like they were avoiding me, sidestepping any conversation where I might push them for a clear answer. I decided to surprise them by taking a day off without telling them. I wanted to be there when they didn't expect it, to see if they'd try to dodge the discussion again. Sure enough, I walked in to find them in the middle of what sounded suspiciously like a planning meeting, with my mom hunched over a notebook and my dad browsing listings on his laptop. They quickly closed everything and gave me tight smiles, clearly uncomfortable with my sudden appearance. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Just organizing a few things," my mom replied, flipping the notebook shut. Nothing important, but the way they acted, the secrecy, the constant excuses, all of it added up. They were planning something, but they had no intention of telling me. It became painfully clear that whatever was going on, it was a lot more calculated than I'd realized. I finally hit a breaking point. That evening, I sat them down for a serious conversation, hoping to bring some sanity back into the situation. "I need to know what your plans are," I said, trying to stay calm but feeling my patience fray. You've been here for months. You've canceled your lease. You're getting mail here. I need to know when you're planning to leave." My dad looked at me with a practiced calm that made my skin crawl. "Evan, you're not seeing the big picture. This arrangement benefits all of us. You have the support of family, and we have a place to stay. Why are you so hung up on timelines?" "Because this is my life, my apartment," I said, feeling the desperation rise in my voice. "I've worked for this independence, and it feels like you're taking it over." But my mom leaned in, her voice almost soothing. "Evan, we're just here to help you live a better life. Isn't that what family's for?" I tried to argue, but they deflected every attempt, turning the conversation around until I was the one who felt guilty, unreasonable, as though wanting control over my own space was a sign of selfishness. Any mention of boundaries was met with talk about support and guidance, as if I were ungrateful for having them there. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that whatever I said, however I approached it, they were firmly entrenched in the belief that they were helping me, even if it meant taking over every aspect of my life. They'd crafted their own version of reality where I couldn't survive without them, and they were unwilling to consider any other perspective. I felt trapped in my own home, and for the first time, I understood that this wasn't just a temporary stay. They'd come here with a plan, and they had no intention of ever leaving. The unspoken agenda, their steady erosion of my independence, the way they twisted every confrontation into proof of my need for them, it all pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. They weren't here to help me. They were here to control me. And unless I found a way to stop them, I would lose the life I'd worked so hard to build. The line between my life and my parents' interference blurred more and more every day. I tried to set boundaries, to have straightforward conversations about their plans, but each time I attempted to assert control, they twisted it around, turning my concerns into evidence that I wasn't ready to be on my own. The very thing I'd built, my independence, was slipping away faster than I could grasp it. One evening, I came home after a long day, hoping to unwind, only to find my dad sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of him. My financial documents, bank statements, credit card bills, pay stubs. I froze, feeling a jolt of anger rise up. "Dad, what are you doing with my financial papers?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked up, completely unfazed. "I was just reviewing some things. Lori and I think it'd be wise to go over these together, see where we can cut costs. You know, pooling resources. It's more efficient if we're all on the same page." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. On the same page? This is my income, my expenses. You don't need to be involved in my finances. He let out a small chuckle, patting the stack of papers like he knew something I didn't. "Evan, you're young. You don't see the bigger picture yet. If we all pitch in and work together, we can create a stronger financial future for everyone." I wanted to argue, to pull the papers out of his hands and tell him to leave my business alone, but a small part of me worried that he was right, that I'd somehow missed some bigger picture. That little seed of doubt he planted was all they needed. They'd become experts at making me second-guess myself, leaving me questioning every decision I made. It didn't stop at my finances. They started dropping hints that my job wasn't right for me, suggesting I consider other career paths. One morning over breakfast, my mom handed me a list of local companies, places where she thought I should look into applying. "I know you like your job, Evan," she said, "but wouldn't it be nice to have something more stable, something that offers better benefits?" "I don't need a new job, Mom. I like where I work," I replied, barely containing my frustration. She sighed, shaking her head. "I just think you're settling, that's all. We only want what's best for you. Maybe if you just kept an open mind, you'd see the wisdom in looking at other options." What she really meant, of course, was that she thought I wasn't good enough at managing my own life. Over time, her comments became more pointed, and soon, both she and my dad were chiming in on my career decisions as though they had any say. My own ambitions were sidelined in favor of their idea of what a safe, stable job looked like. It was as if they believed I'd fail without their guidance, and any hint of independence or confidence I showed was seen as naive rebellion. And every time I tried to push back, they turned the tables. "Evan, we've done so much for you," my mom would say, looking hurt, as if I were the one infringing on their space instead of the other way around. We're here because we love you, because we want you to succeed. Don't you trust us? It wasn't trust. It was manipulation. They'd mastered the art of using guilt to control me, and it was working. I started second-guessing everything: my job, my spending habits, my friends. I'd begun to feel like I couldn't make a single decision without their input. Then, one night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, a thought struck me. Why were they so insistent on controlling everything? I knew they'd always had a certain disregard for planning or saving, but something about this arrangement felt too calculated, too intentional. And that's when I started digging. I started with their old apartment, or what used to be their apartment before they canceled the lease. After a few calls, I learned that they hadn't left because of temporary financial troubles. They'd been evicted. I didn't know the exact reasons, but I had a hunch it had to do with months of unpaid rent. The building manager hinted at a history of financial irresponsibility and conflicts with neighbors. Apparently, this wasn't the first time they'd been in trouble. From there, I dug deeper, reaching out to distant family members and anyone who'd known them longer than I had. What I found was a disturbing pattern. My parents had a history of leeching off others, friends, family, even strangers they'd manipulated into feeling sorry for them. They'd always found ways to insert themselves into people's lives, subtly taking over, until they were living off their generosity. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that I was just their latest mark. They'd moved in, claiming it was temporary, but they'd never intended to leave. In their minds, my life wasn't mine at all. It was a continuation of the same arrangement they'd had with others, where they called the shots and lived off someone else's efforts. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal, but there was also an undeniable relief. Finally, I understood why nothing I did was ever enough. It wasn't that they thought I was incapable. It was that they needed me to feel incapable so that they could keep me under their control. Armed with this knowledge, I tried once again to confront them. This time, I was ready to stand firm, to set real boundaries. "I know what's been going on," I said one evening, as they sat across from me at the kitchen table, pretending to be engrossed in their budget planning. My dad looked up, feigning innocence. "What do you mean, Evan? I know you got evicted. I know you've done this to other people before. I'm not here to be your personal bank account or your retirement plan." My mom's expression shifted to shock, but she quickly masked it with a look of hurt. "Evan, how could you say that? We're your parents. We love you." "It doesn't feel like love. It feels like control. You're treating me like a child, so I'll keep doing what you want. But I'm done. I want my life back." There was a heavy silence, then a flicker of something cold in my dad's eyes. "So, this is what we get for everything we've done for you," he said, his voice low, simmering with resentment. "You'd throw us out just because things got a little difficult? You're the ones making it difficult. I don't owe you my life." Their faces hardened, and my mom put a hand to her heart, looking at me as if I'd just stabbed her. "We're family, Evan. Family supports each other. You're acting like we're strangers, like we haven't been there for you all these years." Guilt clawed at me, but I pushed it down. I wasn't falling for it this time. "No, you haven't been there for me. You've been here for you." They sat in silence, stunned by my resistance, and for the first time since they'd moved in, I saw a flash of vulnerability in their expressions. But that vulnerability quickly turned to anger, and I knew then that this wasn't going to end without a fight. That night, I resolved to find a way out of this mess, whatever it took. I'd reclaimed the truth about their intentions, but I hadn't yet reclaimed my home. And as I lay in bed, piecing together a plan, I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't let them win. I'd finally reached my limit. Armed with everything I'd discovered about my parents' history of manipulation, I was ready to reclaim my life. My friends, who had watched my growing frustration over the past months, rallied around me, offering support and advice. Some even recommended lawyers specializing in tenant rights, and I began quietly exploring my options. I was no longer willing to let my parents dictate my life or invade my home. The day of reckoning came on a Saturday afternoon. I found Lori and Ron sitting in the living room, engrossed in what looked like yet another plan to improve our shared life. I didn't waste time with small talk. "I need to talk to you both now." They looked up, and something in my tone must have given them pause. My dad put down his papers, and my mom gave me that familiar wary glance. "I know what's been going on," I said firmly, standing in front of them. "I know you've done this before, moving in with family, manipulating them, taking over their space until they're forced to take care of you. This isn't about helping me. It's about you using me to avoid responsibility." My mom's face went pale, but she recovered quickly, folding her arms defensively. "Evan, how could you accuse us of something like that? We're your parents." "Yes, you are," I replied, my voice steady. "And I've tried to support you. But this was supposed to be temporary. Instead, you've treated my apartment like it's yours and made every part of my life something you control. This has to end." My dad leaned forward, his tone laced with resentment. "So, you'd throw us out on the street? After all we've done for you?" The guilt tactic had lost its power. "You've done nothing but try to undermine my independence since you got here. I'm giving you 2 weeks to make arrangements and leave. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." My mom's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her voice shaking. "Evan, you can't mean that. We're family. This isn't how family treats each other." "No," I said, holding her gaze. "This isn't how family treats each other. Family doesn't take over someone's life under the guise of helping them." They sat in stunned silence, processing my ultimatum. I could see the shock turn into something darker, a mixture of hurt, anger, and a final attempt to guilt-trip me. My dad stood up, his face hard. "Fine. If that's what you want, we'll go. Just don't expect us to be there for you when you need us." I felt a pang of sadness, but it was outweighed by relief. "I'm okay with that," I replied. "I need my life back." In the 2 weeks that followed, the apartment felt tense, like a storm just waiting to break. My parents packed slowly, dragging their heels, giving me cold stares, and muttering under their breath about ungrateful children. But I stayed firm, ignoring their attempts to sway me, keeping my focus on the light at the end of this ordeal. Finally, the day came. My parents packed their last bag, standing by the door with matching expressions of resentment and bitterness. My mom's face was tight, lips pressed into a thin line, while my dad looked at me with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. "Is this really how you're going to remember us, Evan?" my mom asked, her voice trembling as she tried one last time to sway me. "We gave you everything, and this is the thanks we get?" I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to let her words stir up the guilt they usually did. I'd already come too far to let them manipulate me again. "I appreciate what you did for me when I was growing up," I said, keeping my tone as steady as possible. "But this is different. You can't take over my life in the name of helping me. I need my own space, and I need you to respect that," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. But I caught the flicker of something almost like regret in her expression before she looked away. My dad shifted, clearing his throat, and gave me one last glare. "You'll regret this, Evan. Don't come running to us when you realize how hard it is to manage on your own." I nodded, unfazed. "I've been managing on my own just fine." Without another word, they left, the door closing behind them with a heavy, resounding finality. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, a place that finally felt like it was mine again. The silence, once tense and filled with judgment, now felt like freedom. I took a deep breath, the weight that had been crushing me for months lifting with each exhale. I'd gotten so used to their constant presence, their rules, their comments, that it felt strange to have the apartment to myself again. But the relief was unmistakable. I could stay up as late as I wanted, invite friends over without second thoughts, and, most importantly, live my life without feeling like I was under constant scrutiny. Piece by piece, I reclaimed my space, rearranging the furniture, putting things back where I wanted them, and filling the fridge with whatever food I chose. Reflecting on the whole ordeal, I realized just how much I'd let my own guilt keep me trapped. I'd learned a hard lesson about boundaries and how important they were, even with family. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they have a right to control you or take advantage of you. And for the first time in my life, I felt strong enough to say no. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my independence and reestablishing the relationships I'd neglected. My friends welcomed me back with open arms, and their support reminded me of what real connection looked like. Life started to feel like my own again, and as I embraced this new freedom, I knew one thing for sure. I would never allow anyone to take over my life like that again. It was my life, my space, and finally, I was free to live it on my own terms.